Okay, in this video we are going to discuss basic data types and also how to run JavaScript programs. Okay, so there are two main ways to run JavaScript programs. Last time we talked about the JavaScript console in the browser. If you open the developer tools and click on console, you have access to a JavaScript console. Or if you've installed NodeJS, you can just type node and you have access to a terminal-based JavaScript console. Okay, but what if you want to run a program that you've already written? You don't want to just write JavaScript code one line at a time in the console. You want to write a whole program. Okay, so there's two main ways to do that. The first is with the browser implementation. So I'm going to create a file. This is going to be a simple HTML file. We'll call it js.html. And I need to create the basics of an HTML document. Okay, so if you've not done that before, you can kind of pause here. This might seem a little bit foreign to you. If you've not done any HTML, you might just focus on doing it the next way we're going to show you how to do. But if you've been following this series, we've already done HTML. So you could put a little title in here and say JavaScript, and put a little heading in here just so we can see a title. That's kind of nice. JavaScript. And then we add the script tag, script. Now anything in this script tag is going to be interpreted as JavaScript by the browser. So I can type in console.log. That's how we log messages to the console. And I could say starting application. All right, we can close that. Go to the desktop, open this in a browser, and there is our title tag, our h1 tag. We open the console, and this is showing that the JavaScript is actually running. Okay, so I could make a whole JavaScript program and just run it in the browser, and that's fine. This is one way you could do that, right? Just have your script tag, and any additional JavaScript you would place in between the opening script tag and the closing script tag. All right, that is one option. Another option is to create a JS file, and this is intro.js. Right? Notice the extension is JS for JavaScript, and we're going to use this, and we're going to run this with NodeJS. Console.log. Don't forget your semicolons. JavaScript is very forgiving, and if you leave them off, more often than not, it will be fine with it. There are some cases where you do need them, so it's just a good practice to use them after every line. Alright, so we save this, and we have one line of JavaScript. So console.log is a function. So when we have a function, we have to use left and right parentheses to call the function, and then what goes inside of the parentheses are called arguments. So we have one argument here, and it's this string data. Okay, string data is surrounded by quotation marks. All right, so we can save this, and now I can go to my terminal. My terminal is in on my desktop. Right, I can type ls and see that I have intro.js, and I can run this file using node, and the command is node space and then the file intro.js. And we see it runs the JavaScript. I only have one line of JavaScript. Okay, so running application as a JS file. Let's do that. And we run it again. We saved, and we ran it again, and running application as a JS file. All right, so if you have this file, you can also theoretically import that into your HTML document. There's a couple of places that it's common to import JavaScript. If the JavaScript is meant to mostly just define a library and not actually execute any real code, just add a bunch of declarations and functionality declarations, variable declarations, that sort of thing, you can add a script tag here and say source equals, and we'd say intro.js. And then we close our tag. Right? So what this is going to do is it's going to look in the directory that js.html is in, and it's going to look for a file called intro.js. And if it finds that file, it's going to load it on our page and run it immediately before any of this other stuff is created. So if this needs to reference the body tag does not yet exist. Okay? So if any scripts that you write like this need to reference any HTML that's already been defined, instead of placing it up here, you should place it as one of the last siblings of the body tag. Okay, so here we've got JavaScript written within this HTML page, and here we're importing intro.js 2 different times. Once at the very beginning, then we've got our script tag that's inline in the HTML, and then we're including the JavaScript intro.js script again. Alright, so we can run this in the browser, reload the page, and we see running application as JS file executed first. Then this is our script tag where we're actually writing JavaScript within the browser, and then we included our script again. Okay, so what you can see here is it is kind of nice because you can run JavaScript in 2 different ways. I can run intro.js directly with Node, and I can run that same JS file in the browser. Now there is a trick to this, or something to be aware of rather. It's important that you don't use certain functionality available in Node. So Node has access to your file systems and devices and various other things that the browser does not have access to. Okay, so there is some subset of JavaScript functionality that you can use that's applicable to both Node and the browser. But if you do some stuff in Node, you can only run that code with Node and it won't work in the browser properly. Okay, so that is important. But for basic things, for playing with the language and experimenting with features, both of these ways should work fine, and you should be able to include any code we write with the .js extension. As long as it doesn't have special features of Node, you should be able to run it in the browser or using Node from the command line. Okay, so that's how we can run a couple different versions of JavaScript. So for the most part, we're going to be using NodeJS to run JavaScript because it's a little bit easier and you don't have to sift through all of this extra HTML stuff. Okay, but I did want to show you that it is possible to run the JavaScript within an HTML file and just include the file like this. All right. So for the rest of most of this JavaScript tutorial, we're going to be using JS files and running them with Node.js. Okay, so we can kind of close out of this js.html. Okay, so this is our first line of JavaScript. It's a console.log. So this is an important function to remember. We're going to be using it all the time. All right. This entire thing is a JavaScript statement. Notice the semicolon. After JavaScript statements, we have semicolons. All right. We talked about variables last time. Now we're going to get into data types. We're going to talk about the basic data types first. Okay. So we're going to create some variables. All right. And we have the concept of a number. Right. So the number 5. Let x equal 5. And then we have some programming languages have a distinction between integer values and floating point decimals. So y can equal 0.75. Console.log. Now I can pass in multiple arguments to console.log, and I have to separate them with commas. Okay, so I can pass in x and then y, and that will print to my console these values that I've just declared and assigned. Okay, so this is a declaration and assignment statement in one, declaring the variable y and assigning in one line. Okay, so we run this node and intro. Right, and so we see it prints out the number, and then because we have a comma, it goes ahead and adds a space. All right. So if I have multiple items here, it will add a space between them. So I need to know, is there a difference between these two variables? Is the way that these are stored in the computer different? Well, in JavaScript, they're generally the same. This is a number type. So console.log, we can use the typeof keyword. So typeof is a keyword, and what you place after typeof, the typeof keyword will evaluate that value and determine what type of data it is and return that type as a string value. Okay, so if I say type of X and then I duplicate this line and say type of Y, watch out for your copy and paste because you can copy and paste mistakes. There we go. All right, console.log. So type of X and then type of Y. Notice one is an integer and one is a decimal value. So if I run this, we see in JavaScript these are both referred to as number. There's no distinction between a integer value and a floating point decimal value. Okay, so also it's important to note that typeof returns a string value. So I can say console.log type of X, does this equal number? Okay, so in JavaScript, when we're comparing things, we almost always want to use the triple equal sign, and we'll go into that in just a minute. Okay, so you see this true here. That's saying the type of X equals the string number. So these two things are the same. Another way of showing that type of returns string data, console.log type of X. Right, so what we're doing here is let's get the type of X, and that's going to return number, the string number, and then we're going to get the type of that. So the string number, the type of that should be string. Okay, so there we go. We see it is string. So type of becomes very important. We can see what is stored in variables. Of course, you can use type of by itself, or let's type node and type of. Now here I'm creating a string literal. This is the string character's cat, so this is quite obviously going to return the value string. Okay. Now in JavaScript, you can create strings using double quotes to start and end the string, or single quotes. And there's also another way you can do it that we will get into later. All right, so a lot of times the default in JavaScript will be to use single quotes. I like to use double quotes because it's more universal across languages, but either way is valid and legal and perfectly fine. Okay, so as we see, type of the string literal cat returns string. I can also say type of 55.5 is a number. There are also what's known as Boolean values. So this is a Boolean literal. Boolean values are true and false. In JavaScript, it's important. The true keyword represents the Boolean value, and it is all lowercase, whereas in Python it's capitalized. All right, and you can have false. So Boolean values are very important, but there's only two values, right? True and false. So the interesting thing with Boolean values is how you combine these things. You have Boolean expressions that evaluate to various different ways to evaluate to true or false, using ands and ors and XORs and nots, that sort of thing. And we'll go into Boolean logic a little bit later. Okay, so we have three types so far, number types. With number types, we can perform arithmetic operations, right? Console.log x plus y, x minus y, x times y, and then x divided by y, those sorts of things. Type of, oh, I'm still in my, there we go, exit out, run my program, Okay, so we can see that 5 plus 0.75 is 5.75. You can subtract, you can multiply, and you can add or divide. Now division can be a little tricky in JavaScript. Do not always count on the precision in JavaScript. Okay, the reason being is that the way that they store numbers in JavaScript is uses a binary exponential, and that does not always equate to a decimal exponential value representation of that number, and so you might get decimals that are slightly off sometimes. Okay, so be aware of that. Anything that requires extreme accuracy with your numbers, you might want to use specific mathematical libraries in JavaScript. For all of our purposes, it's always going to be very, very close. So if you need extreme precision, probably don't want to use JavaScript arithmetic. But for most of our purposes, it's going to be close enough. And we'll get into a little bit more of that later. All right. So we got 3 types so far: number, string, and Boolean. All right. And really, these are the main types, the main basic data types that you're going to be using. Everything else is a concept of a collection. There's also the idea of a function. Okay, so variables store data, right? And we have 3 different data types that are kind of our basic data types, and we can store the data in the variables. A function is something that stores an action. It stores lines of JavaScript code to be executed when the function is called. So there's 2 ways to define functions. I can use the function keyword, then the function name, which is the identifier. And the identifiers, the rules for using identifiers is just the same as variables, right? Variables have identifiers as well. And it can be lowercase alphabetical characters, uppercase alphabetical characters, underscore, or numbers within them, but they can't start with a number. Okay, so this is my function. I can call it foo, right? And then left and right parentheses, what arguments do I want for the function to have? So x and y. So this function is going to take in as input 2 arguments, x and y. I'm going to use actually different variable names just so you don't get confused with this x and y. It has nothing to do with that x and y. I could call them x and y though, that's fine. So I'm going to call these a and b, and they're my 2 arguments to this function. And this function is going to do one thing only. It's going to, we'll say it creates a variable result. Oops. Let result equal and a plus b. All right, and then it's going to return that result. Okay, in this case, we are creating a variable called result. We are taking the inputs that we got from the function a and b and adding them together. So this is an expression that gets evaluated down to one single value. This one single value is then stored in our variable result, because this entire line is a declaration / assignment statement. It's doing 2 things at once. We're declaring the variable result and assigning a value, a plus b. Then we have a return statement. So this is what this function evaluates to. So result is a plus b. That is what this function evaluates to when it is called. So I can call it multiple different ways. Console.log. Okay, console.log is just how we log things to our terminal view. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to call my function. At this point in time, JavaScript has only defined the function. This code will not run until I call the function. So here we say foo and 5 and 6. So this is a function call. 5 is going to be the first argument here, and 6 is the second argument, b. So when I call this function, the code inside, the code defined inside of this function executes. And we start out with a equal to 5 and b equal to 6 because that's what we passed in as input. So in this particular case, a is 5, b is 6. We create a variable result, 5 plus 6, so result is going to be 11, and we return that. So console.log is going to, this is going to evaluate to the return value, which is 11. So it's as if we have this. right? And we can even do that above, console.log 11, to show it's the same thing, right? So foo is executing the function foo. So to execute a function or to call a function, you do the identifier name of that function, you type that in, and then left and right parentheses, and inside those parentheses are the inputs to that function. And we can run this, and we see 11 and 11. Now we can run this function as many times as we like, console.log foo, and I can pass in different values. So that's kind of the power. This code always is the same code, but depending on the input values, we get different results. So I can have 33 and 11 and print that out. Okay, but the important thing to remember is in an expression, the function evaluates to whatever its return value is. Okay, so for example, console.log, I can have an expression of values foo of 1 and 2 plus 5 plus foo of 11 and 3. Okay, this entire thing is one argument to console.log. There is only one argument here. The argument is an expression. Expressions evaluate down to one single value. We know this is an expression because if we look at it, we have an operand, an operator, an operand, operator, and an operand. Okay, so that's kind of what expressions are composed of. Operators and operands, other expressions, and function calls. So this function call evaluates to one value. So let's look. JavaScript is going to say, okay, we have a function call. We need to see if we have a function defined as foo. It looks up in the code and finds, yes, we do. We do have a function, and this is the function, so we're going to take the inputs from foo, 1 and 2, and assign them to A and B, and then we're going to create a variable result and say 1 plus 2 equals 3, and we're going to return 3. So essentially, as far as JavaScript is concerned, after that point, there's a 3 here, right? And then we go and we say plus 5. So JavaScript looks at this and says, can I evaluate that to a single value? I sure can, and as far as JavaScript is concerned, this turns into an 8. Now we have 8 plus this function call. Can I evaluate this to a single value? Not yet. JavaScript first has to call this function to get a value. Right? So we look, JavaScript sees the identifier foo. Do we have a function called foo? It looks up in the code. Yes, yes we do. Pass in these arguments to foo. That's 11 for A and 3 for B. And then the result is going to be 11 plus 3, right, which is 14. We return 14, so this is essentially 14. Right? So that's what gets returned by that function. And then JavaScript looks at this and says, can I evaluate this? Of course you can. This is basic arithmetic. So this is 22. All right, and if we run this, we see both of them evaluate to 22. We did what JavaScript is going to do. We did that right here, but it's the same steps that JavaScript takes to evaluate this. Okay, so it's important to note that expressions always evaluate to a single value. All right, and functions always evaluate to their return values. If they don't have a return value, they evaluate to undefined. And we can show that real quick. Function return undefined. That's the name of my function, and I'm just gonna return. All right, or if I don't return anything, that's an empty function. That's allowed as well, and I can say console.log return undefined. There are no arguments in undefined here. I can pass in arguments, but it won't matter. I won't get an error. Some languages you'll get an error if you pass in too many arguments. I can pass in arguments here, and JavaScript will pass them in, but there's no variables defined here, so it won't do anything. So that's fine. And we run this, and we see we get a result of undefined. We get the result of undefined if I return with no return value, we still get undefined, or I can explicitly return with undefined. Undefined is also a keyword. Okay, so those three things are pretty much the same. If the function ends without a return statement, it returns undefined. If the function returns without a value, it returns undefined. And if it explicitly returns undefined, it obviously returns undefined. Okay, so that function, this idea of a function, is another actual type in JavaScript. So we talked about numbers, strings, and Boolean values. There's also another type, function. Console.log. And the keyword we use to determine the type is typeof. And let's see what the type of return undefined is. It's a function. All right. So the type of return undefined is a function. And then there's a couple other data types to be aware of. Type of undefined is undefined. So if I have a variable holding undefined, for example, a variable that I have declared but not assigned a value to, so I picked this name unassigned, and I'm just going to declare this variable, but I'm not going to give it a value. And I can say console.log type of unassigned. So the type of that is undefined, right? Just like the type of undefined is undefined, right? Another one is you don't use as much as undefined, but sometimes it shows up, is the idea of null. Null is used sometimes as a placeholder for no value. It's similar to undefined, but slightly different, and that gets into a little bit of advanced ideas about JavaScript. Now, one distinction between null and undefined is JavaScript considers this to be an object. Obviously, as we see by type of null equals object. So you can create objects in JavaScript using left and right curly brackets. So this is an empty object, console.log type of object. Okay, that's an object. So outside of these basic types, pretty much everything in JavaScript is an object. So objects are like dictionaries in Python. They are key value stores. So they have a value or a key. So this would be A, and a value apple. And you can have multiples be banana. Right. I recommend placing a comma after the last value, and that way if you need to move these items, copy or X and paste, you do have to have a comma after each item, but you do not have to have one at the last item. But if you move these items around, it's nice to have the comma at the end of the last one, so that way you don't have to add it later. All right, so this is an object, and the type of that is object, and it's basically a key value store. So I can access items, console.log object, left and right square brackets, and I specify the key. So this is going to look into my object and look for the key, the string A as the key, and it's going to return the value associated with that key. Alright, so I can run that, and sure enough we get apple. So this is accessing a property of an object by key. You can also in JavaScript, instead of if the key is a normal identifier, you can just say .a, and that does the same thing. So apple, apple. Okay, so this is an object in JavaScript. This is a simple plain object literal. We've literally defined the object in our code. And we also have the concept of arrays. So we have an array, and we define those with left and right square brackets, and I can do something similar, apple and banana. So an array is just like an object, except you access the elements numerically by index. The first item is index 0, and then the second item is index 1. Right? So I can say console.log. I can access the items array 0. And then the last item will always be array.length -1. Okay, so array.length gives you the length of the number of items in your array. And so if there's 2 items, this is 2. So 2 minus 1 is going to give me the index of the last item, because we start indexing at 0, so that's 0. 2 minus 1 is 1. So this should say apple and then banana. Now notice here, this is the last thing, the type of, when we use the type of keyword, notice before we did type of null, and JavaScript said that was an object. If we use type of the array, it's also an object. Yeah, we should probably just print out the object so you can see what it looks like when you print that out directly. OBJ. So we'll print out our array and print out type of our array. Okay, so here's what an object looks like when it's printed out to the screen. Here's an array when it's printed out to the screen. And as you can see, type of array, JavaScript considers that to be an object. And it actually is an object, but it's a special type of object that has a few additional properties. The elements are actually, it's a key value store just like an object, except the keys are indexes. Okay, and it has some extra functionality built in. But behind the scenes, it really is just a JavaScript object. There's just additional features added to it. Okay, so this has been data types in JavaScript, an introduction to the main data types we're going to be using throughout the tutorials in JavaScript, and also how to run JavaScript code using NodeJS, or run a JavaScript file in the browser as well. Okay, so that should conclude this video.